Lawn at Lincoln in the United Kingdom is a Greek Revival building from the early 19th century. It has been called an asylum, or it was in the 1800s, and in 1905 it became known as the Lincoln Lunatic Hospital. Later, in 1921, the name was changed to the Lawn Hospital, and it closed in 1985. It was then owned by the City of Lincoln Council and was used as an events venue until 2016, when it was sold and redeveloped as a new business headquarters with cafe, restaurant, and theater. In 2007 and 2008, my husband and I worked for a UK ghost hunting company. This was one of the locations that they sent us to in 2008. Among other things, when we did ghost hunts, the mainstay practice that this company had us do was something called table tipping, also known as table turning, table tilting, or tapping. It was one method of communicating with spirits. People place their hands on the table and call out to spirit and wait for the table to move. It's similar to the Ouija board, according to Wikipedia. We started the evening with the usual tour around the building. During this time, before the guests arrived, my husband would always take the opportunity to go around to the dark, empty rooms and take photos on his own. This was just for our own interest and our own purpose, no one else's. We knew the evening was going to be eventful when, upon climbing a darkened stairwell, my husband sensed something. Taking a couple of photos, he suddenly heard a loud exhalation breath and ran downstairs quickly as a chill went up his spine. From there, we split into two groups for the evening. I took my group to the bar area that had some tables and chairs. It took about 10 minutes before we began to hear loud taps and bangs in answer to the questions that the people in the room were asking out loud. We sensed a sadness in the room and decided to move to another location. We then entered a narrow hallway that led to a small room. There was a display in there of mannequins and old World War II memorabilia. I'm unsure why that was there. In the corner of the room was a small table. Across from that was an elevator door in the center of the wall. A couple of young men put their hands on the table in the corner. Since it wasn't large enough for all of us to fit around it, the rest of us stood and watched. After a few minutes, the room went quiet and we waited. There was emergency lighting on, so we could see one another well enough. Without warning, the table flew out from under their hands and right at me, hitting me and pushing me against the elevator doors. When this happened, I had a sense of a person hanging right where I was standing. Again, chills and fear at that moment. Later, we found out that someone had hung themselves there. Meanwhile, in another room, my husband was with his group. 6 people stood around a square-type dining table while the rest of them looked on. With their fingers pressed lightly down on the table, they called out to spirits in the room. At first, the table began to lift off the ground, and then it began to bounce up and down. Some people in the room gasped, while others let out a small squeal. The movement stopped for several minutes, then the table began to move again, more slowly. They felt the energy change. It was then that the group began taunting the energy of what they believed was a young woman. My husband asked them to be more respectful because they were calling her names and swearing at her. Again, without warning, the table lifted, and this time it went up to about shoulder height, and they had a hard time keeping their hands on the table. It then flipped over and slammed onto the floor with a crash. Everyone jumped back. A few people screamed. Some people even ran from the room. At another point, toward the end of the evening, both groups met in the main dining hall. In there were heavy, round wooden tables. At one table, there were about 6 people around it again, including my husband this time. What I saw, I would not believe. if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. The table began to move, gently at first from side to side. Then it began to spin or turn in a circular motion. The energy built up so much that the table began to move around the room, with the group having to move quickly to try to maintain their hands on the top of it. This was the highlight of a very active evening of ghost hunting. Freaky or what?